In today's episode, I mistakenly referred to a public issue that occurred in Wyoming. I should have said it was South Dakota. Here's the headline from today's news. Pronouns and tribal affiliations are now forbidden in South Dakota Public University employee emails. A new South Dakota Board of Regents policy keeps employees from including their gender pronouns in school email signatures and other correspondence. This is an important distinction and correction, so I didn't want today's episode to go live without it. This was published on May 24th, 2024, and it references an article in the Dayton Daily News. Thanks so much, and I hope you enjoy today's episode.
If we could actually recognize the value of what each of us brings to the conversation and recognize that I think underneath a lot of us really do have similar values of wanting to be happy, wanting our kids to be happy, wanting to feel safe in the world. We have very different ideas of how to create that. But, if we can recognize those underlying values and figure out how to work together, how to bring each of our strengths to the table, I think we could get a lot further than just dividing ourselves up and fighting and being like, it's this like one side has to win, right? Like we can't work together. One side has to win over the other side.
Welcome to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for people like you who care about the social impact of conscious companies and everyday heroes. Hear inspiring stories from those who put people and planet before profit and personal gain. You'll learn how you can make a difference, vote with your dollars, and get involved today. Here's your host, Corinna Bellizzi.
Hello, fellow do-gooders and friends. I'm your host, Corinna Bellizzi. Throughout the course of this podcast journey, we've covered topics like climate anxiety and the need for a more optimistic mental frame. We've heard from people like the environmentalist Paul Hawken, and we've learned from him that we need to accept that we can't do it all, but rather lean into the things that we can change to do better each day. And we've often addressed the feelings of hopelessness that often surmount when climate disaster after climate disaster strike. The sad truth, even if we stopped all emissions today, we would still experience some of these climate effects for the next 30 years due to what's referred to as climate lag. This means worsening weather, droughts, floods, all of these things that we seemingly can't avoid. And for what other reason? So, what are we, as members of this society who want to build a better future, to really do? To help us tackle this conversation with realness, courage, strength, and perhaps most importantly, compassion, I'm joined by Dr. Sebastienne Grant. She is a distinguished psychologist whose expertise includes mindfulness, compassion, and societal well-being. Having earned her PhD in psychology, consciousness, and society, she draws on critical humanistic, existential, Buddhist, and transpersonal psychological orientations. Her diverse work focuses broadly on the intersections of individual and societal well-being. So, with her deep understanding of existing concerns that we all face, from the societal influences and global issues like climate change, she brings forward insights into fostering personal balance, addressing burnout, which is something that we all suffer from, and supporting a more compassionate, just, and sustainable world. Sebastienne is currently serving as faculty and department chair of psychology at Prescott College in Prescott, Arizona. Sebastienne, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
I wanted to get this conversation started by just learning a little bit about what brought you to this moment.
Well, I think it depends on how far we want to go back, but if we go all the way back to childhood, I think that growing up with a single parent who struggled with mental health issues and also poverty and some other challenges, I think really attuned me to the relationship between societal issues and individual well-being, and pulled my heart toward seeing how those societal issues play out in real people's lives and their families, their impacts on their kids. So when I decided to go to college, I went into psychology. I wanted to see how to support people's mental health. And through that, I became even more attuned to these relationships between societal structures and well-being. I got a job right out of undergrad working in a shelter serving people who were experiencing chronic homelessness. And I was planning to go to grad school after this to be a counselor. But I was thinking as I was working with these people, how I would serve them as a counselor, how I would help them with their mental health issues. And a lot of them were dealing with addiction, depression, anxiety, all of these challenges that for me were so clearly connected to their lack of housing security, their lack of income, their lack of ability to get jobs. Because once you're in this position, it's so hard to get out of it. You don't have an address. Some of them had, minor criminal charges for something they did when they were young and things like this. And so they were kind of stuck in this situation. And I just started thinking like, what can psychology really do to support people who society is failing and whose struggles really come from that? And so I still thought I wanted to be a counselor. So but I went to a really humanistically oriented program at the University of West Georgia, where I was also exposed to critical psychology, which really looks specifically at this relationship between societal structures, between things like capitalism and neoliberalism, economic systems of oppression, and how those interact with our well-being. And I got really pulled into that and started to think, how can we make greater societal and cultural change so that we can actually flourish as humans? And since then, I've started to think even more beyond how it affects individuals, but also the cyclical relationship between societal well-being and individual well-being, and then how we as individuals, when we struggle, contribute to climate change, contribute to income inequality, and these sorts of things. So, it kind of doesn't matter where you start. You can start from the individual level or you can start from the societal level. And for me, I still work mostly at that individual level, but always with that societal level in mind.
I think given us a fertile ground from which to start, especially given this connection to the word compassion that I shared with our introduction. Why do you think that compassion is so critical to individual, societal, and ecological well being? What does it specifically as a concept have to offer?
Yeah, that's a huge question. Also, I think that compassion always has things to offer, but I think that it's specifically valuable at this moment for us because it helps act as a remedy to some of the challenges that we're dealing with. Again, coming out of or still within capitalism and neoliberalism, these things that have really contributed to a lack of connection between people and to feelings of competitiveness that there's only so much in the world and we all have to try and get our share. This misunderstanding that human nature is competitive, greedy, that happiness comes from hedonic material pursuits. All of these things, which are actually, I think, making us miserable, and then of course we seek to try and be happy to help ourselves feel better by reinvesting in these material things. But compassion, it helps us connect to each other. It helps us realize our deep interconnectivity. One of the things that's said in like Buddhist literature a lot is like, my suffering is inseparable from your suffering, and my joy is inseparable from your joy. And this is a really radical idea. Like on the surface, it's like, yeah, sure, like you see someone sad and that makes you feel bad because we have empathy and stuff. But it's not just a feeling, it's true on a very deep level. If some of the humans, if some of the parts of the environment are struggling, are suffering, it impacts the entire system because we're all connected. And compassion really helps us tune into that. And there's some really interesting research about how compassion practices increase in the brain, increase activity in centers related to joy and courage and approach motivation, and decrease activity in centers of the brain related to depression and anxiety and avoidance motivation. So, in order to deal with some of like the big challenge, social and environmental challenges that we have right now, we need courage, we need approach motivation, we need joy, we need connection. Compassion is a really powerful tool to do that.
You're reminding me of a book I read back in my undergrad in a lit class, and it was Lewis Thomas's Lives of a Cell. I don't know if you're familiar with the book, but essentially it was essays that mirrored how the cells in our body reflect how our society is organized, and that each of these elements within even a single cell are vital to the health of the whole. I mean, you could really extol this into a concept of what is Earth. And, if you were to look at Earth by comparison to the parts of a cell, we could just be individual little parts of that cell, like the mitochondria that are creating energy, or the flagella that are supporting, DNA and little itty bitty things within each of our cells that support our overall health, longevity, and life. And when we start to look at life as a whole that way, then it's easier, I think, to understand the interconnectedness and why, when we see one part of society really sick, it impacts the health of the whole, whether or not it's something that we're flat out realizing in the day to day. You get confronted with the negative news, and then at a certain point, people start to callous themselves against it and start to disengage from that topic or that thought, or turn off the news because they can't handle just the constant barrage of negativity. And that alone is actually an unhealthy thing to do, as much as it might be protective, right? It's saying, I don't want to be integrated in society in such a way where I have to confront the bad. And I think this is what leads, many activists to feel completely burnt out, to feel like you can't make a difference. Like, gosh, these problems are all just too big. What could little old me do? And, I interviewed Anne-Therese Gennari on this show, who calls herself the climate optimist, who has written the Climate Optimist Handbook. And sometimes, even as I go through content like that, I'm like, yeah, but what about that tornado that just ripped through Texas? And the very next day, everybody wants to go on to business as usual. It's not usual. We are not living in usual times. And so, how do we as a people confront those from mental health capacity so that we can remain compassionate without feeling overwhelmed and then disengage?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think that optimism is important. We certainly don't want to be hopeless, and we often fall into hopelessness and despair. This is right now. There's within sort of the climate change psych literature. There's a really close connection between climate anxiety and despair and climate denial. And often if you're on the side of believing that climate change is a human caused phenomenon and is dangerous, we say, oh, those climate deniers, they're the problem. But we actually see that when people fall into despair and when their anxiety gets too high, their level of action is about the same as people who are deniers, right? It just plummets. And so it's something that we need to take really seriously. How do we
It's
deal with
even
this?
seen in how we
Um,
eat. Like people, this is something I talked about on a recent podcast just about diet nutrition. And it's like when we break the seal on the bag of chips, even if we just intended to get one serving, well, screw the diet now. I started in on this thing. I'm going to finish the whole bag, or jelly beans or whatever that thing is. It's like if we just tell ourselves, well, screw it now. I already did it. So I'm going to just lean into the mess, I guess, because I can't go back now. And I fear that that's kind of where we get when we're stuck in these feelings of helplessness. And I think that's really it. So, in my mind, community engagement helps, but it can also get to the point where you feel like, gosh, I'm just not able to make this work. One, for instance, that I just came across today had to do with mangrove restoration. And, this is one simple problem. And it's not simple, it's a big problem that we've had. All these mangrove forests in South America have been degraded. And so initially, a community got involved and they started planting trees. They planted mangrove trees and they thought that would be sufficient. But what happened is that they would get these flooding storms that come in. And before the mangrove had actually rooted enough, they got washed away. Or because the channels or the canals that had once been there, naturally speaking, were somehow getting clogged with sediment because so much water had moved so much soil through roots that no longer existed to hold it in place, that water would stagnate. And so the roots that were trying to take root would essentially go septic and then they would die. And so the community had to come in and say, we're going to find a new way. So they had to essentially dig canals out and then keep the canals open so that when they planted these new mangroves, that they could take root, that the fresh water could come in and it could also go back out to sea so that they wouldn't get these stagnated pools of water that became essentially, anaerobic. It was such an interesting case study of what it took. And it took both perseverance and dedication and community to solve it because people were just about to throw their arms up and go, you know what? I can't do this.
Yeah. Oh, you said so many things I want to respond to, but that's a really beautiful example. I think that this all ties into, well, individualism, feeling the hopelessness and despair that comes from feeling like we can't do anything alone. But we're never acting alone, even if we're not aware of the people that we're acting with as a movement, we are, but finding community to actively act with, I think, can be really helpful. And also this attitude in the West that gets identified in these discussions, that we don't want to invest in anything that we can't win at completely. And so with climate change, with social problem, with lots of the big problems that we tackle, it's not like we can make a plan and then we're going to do it and next week everything is going to be perfect and we're going to be living in a utopia and all the problems are going to be solved forever. And things often happen over multiple lifetimes, so change happens, but it happens slow according to our perception, based on the length of our timelines. Um, and everything is impermanent, and nothing's ever going to be finalized. So we're never going to get to the end of a problem. I mean, maybe discrete small problems, but not these large systemic problems. And so it's hard for us to find ways in to get excited and feel motivated when it feels like something, we can just sort of chip away at. I think bringing up Paul Hawken is a really great author. His book, what's it called? Blessed. I've got it somewhere.
I think it's
Is it
blessed
Blessed
unrest
and
and
Rest?
then the
Yeah.
drawdown. Yeah.
He talks about, yeah, and he talks about how if we zoom out, we can see all of this really relatively fast and radical change that's happening largely through grassroots, locally based community action where people are getting together, figuring out how to deal with the problems that are in their communities. And those are easier to deal with too. You talk about the mangroves, like it was a really big problem. They had to go through multiple solutions, but they found something that kind of worked. We can do that. If we're trying to fix climate change in the abstract, in the total, that's a problem that we are never going to feel like we can solve in our lifetime. So I think focusing on those things that we can actually do, working with others, but then also I think there's a place for also letting ourselves grieve what what we have lost, what we will lose. We are very, our society also has, and psychology's played a big role in this, has essentially pathologized suffering. So if you're suffering, you're failing, something's wrong, and you shouldn't look to the root of it. You should figure out how to put band-aids on it, right? So I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling sad about the polar bears, so I'm gonna watch a funny TV show or I don't know, do something to distract myself. And there's a place for that. We all need to take breaks, you know? But if we don't let ourselves feel it and grieve also, we're constantly cutting ourselves off, like you said, hardening our hearts. And that also cuts us off from the love and joy and connection and relationship that we could be having with each other and with the earth that nourishes our motivation and our hope over the long term.
100%. I wanted to dive a little deeper into this concept of bringing alternative visions in, especially as we move through things like a climate crisis. On this podcast, we have interviewed Nina Simons, who's the founder of Bioneers, about her book, Nature, Culture, and the Sacred. And when she talks a lot about relational leadership, and I understand this is something that you also talk about. So I'd love to know how your perspective helps to bring these concepts together. And, really, if we can just define for people what it means to bring in these viewpoints and ultimately collaborate on a deeper level within a community.
I haven't read the book you just mentioned, but I think that Adrienne Marie Brown's Emergent Strategy is also a really brilliant one for thinking about how we can work together in ways that align with the way that nature works. It's kind of system series biomimicry. But I guess I haven't really thought about relational leadership. Like I think a lot of the work I do does align with that, but I haven't thought about it in those terms. But I'm always thinking about interconnectivity, deep interconnectivity, how we're all connected, how everything we do creates ripples, and how we haven't gotten into the situation that we're in by acting as individuals. We've done it by acting as a collective, many collectives. And that's what we're going to have to do to get out of it too. And that's really hard for us. So, one of the places where I think there's some amazing alternative visions coming in is in Afrofuturist, indigenous, queer, and feminist climate fiction and science fiction. It's really taking a different approach to, often we see in mainstream sci-fi films, there's the impending apocalypse, and then there's the one soul hero, usually a man, usually a white man, who has to, take this on and save the world. And that's kind of like our narrative. But of course, when we think about the reality of that, it's like, oh, but no one person can do this, right? And these narratives coming from these other spaces are really about, if there is a hero, if there's a leader, it's someone who can activate the community and can get people together and, to working together to re-envision something and to rebuild something.
I'm guessing you've
And
read,
also to
The
think,
Fifth Sacred Thing by Starhawk. I'm guessing you've read that. Have you not read that?
I haven't read this
It's
one.
okay,
Okay,
so
I'm going to
this
write it
one
down.
is, over 30 years old now, but I think it's like the grandmother, essentially, of ecofiction. So Starhawk is a, really incredible human being. I have met her and interviewed her on this podcast, which was just amazing. She's Wiccan, so she's an author of Wiccan works. She also is really a permaculturist, so she's a steward of the land and teaches people to live in concert with nature and to do things like grow olive trees among other animals and wildlife. Yeah, she's just quite the individual. And in that story, she imagines a world that is led by women in Northern California, separated from a more extractive, resource oriented Southern California, which to me sometimes doesn't seem too far from the truth. And so I had to go back and reread it recently because I had her on the show, and it's out there as a 30th anniversary audiobook as well, which is also exceptionally acted. So I'll be sure to include links to both the interview and where you can find the book with show notes. But I found it to be an incredible reflection on how groups can align and how worrying over resources is just one of the stupidest things that we ever do. So, if we can take a shift away from this mine versus yours into an ours, and make that a part of this new eco revolution that is more futurist and aligns with the benefit of the whole as opposed to the soul, then I think that we can really move towards positive change. But critics of that line of thinking are doing things like saying, no, Wyoming, you can't have he, she, they, them pronouns listed in your email signatures. And we don't acknowledge different genders. And there's this backlash happening at the same time in our society, which to me says there's a significant portion of our populace that just isn't ready to move there yet. As many of us that might want to initiate something that is more communally focused, not to say communistic, but more focused on what we're doing as a part of our society together than on this forever achievement, answering to the gods of Wall Street. So, how do you think that we can move into a new era? Is it possible?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I wrote a book chapter in a book called Subjectivity in Psychology in the Era of Social Justice that talks about the role of the subjectivity that's been created under neoliberalism, individualism, and kind of the modern era, the modern subject, and how incompatible it is with social justice. And so I kind of have this like call to action for psychology to think about the subjectivity constructions that it's contributing to and think about how we can support the creation of subjectivities that would be more compatible with social justice. So I think this is a real problem because people believe themselves to be separate individuals. They believe that the path to happiness is a material path, that everybody is out to get what they can. And they believe that many people believe that the current system that we have is the best path to that. And those tend to be the people for whom the system is working, right? And so, oh, well, it's not broken, so why should we do anything about it?
I
And
bought
they
my
really
new
want to hold on
Tesla,
to that. But
I'm doing
even,
just fine.
yeah, but I believe, and there's a lot of empirical research coming out to support this, that actually it's not even for the people that it's working best for, it's still not working. That people are still feeling alienated and empty and disconnected and fearful and all of these things, but they don't know where else to go. And so one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately is like our resistance to ontological trauma or ontological shock, which is this, like, we believe the world works a certain way, and if we come up against something that challenges that, we either have to deny it or we have to change our belief. But that throws us into kind of an existential crisis or an ontological crisis of like, oh, I don't know. I thought this was how the world works. I don't know how the world works. I don't know how anything works. And then we're like ungrounded for a while until we reground, right? So I think that it's something that we can't just leave people behind or say like, oh, those people, they're being stubborn or they're being selfish or whatever. I think we really have to account for that fear that the world is changing, that basically what we've been told is good for humans and will make a good society and will make us happy for hundreds of years now, and that's coming even before that off colonialism. We could probably stretch it to thousands of years, that we've been wrong and we need something else. And I think there's starting to be movements. I think it's going to take different things to convince different people. So there's a lot of research coming out that's showing that financial success, that career success, these different things that we thought would make us happy, that they're not really once you get kind of to a level of comfort, having your basic needs met. This falls off, that there's also consequences. We seem to have decreased close relationships, decreased communities, decreased sense of meaning, things like this that are really important. So some people might be, partially convinced by the research. Some people are going to be convinced by experience, maybe seeing examples of people in their community who are living differently. There's starting to be these huge movements of simplicity, tiny house movements, minimalism, back to the earth. Some people are doing it in a way that is probably extreme enough that the everyday person isn't going to connect with it. But I think a lot of people are finding really tangible, realistic ways to reclaim connection and joy and these things that we've kind of had to give up that can be inspiring for the people around them. So I do think there's a movement happening already, but maybe you've caught me on an optimistic day, but I think that's the thing, is that this is a really big element, is I feel like that often the conversation is, we've been bad. The humans, we've been bad, we've screwed up. And the people who are the most resistant to the change are the people that we point our fingers out the hardest. It's your fault. You're the reason that this happened. And you need to give up your Tesla, and you need to give up your big house, and you need to eat nothing but tofu and brown rice or whatever and not use any electricity. And that's what we have to do to save the earth. That's a hard sell, right? Like, nobody wants to do that. But I don't think that's true. I think that we have so much beauty and joy and love and connection and meaning to reclaim. And I think that if we start there, if we start inviting people into that, then their grasp on these things that they're trying to use to make themselves happy will naturally soften as their actual needs start to be met.
Well, I have to say, I think that there is a movement with younger people to not want to be saddled by immense debt, which in some form says things like, well, I'm not sure that I need to go to college. Perhaps I want to perform a trade and that will make more sense for me. In some cases, it means I'm not really planning to own a house. And maybe I do want to get a tiny home or something that requires less of a 30-year commitment, so to speak. Maybe I want to be a digital nomad. Maybe I want to go live in Italy and perform my work there, as opposed to living in Los Angeles or San Francisco or New York City or one of these other spaces where there's a lot of public transport and you might not need a car and all these other things. Like we're moving towards, I think, we're moving in the direction of this movement that says, I don't need all of that junk. And I don't think people of my generation as much, I'm Gen X, are as willing to necessarily let go of the accumulation of things that they might have. But even if we just start to think about, you know, having a little less, buying a little less new, working to make things more durable and investing in things that are naturally made as opposed to purely extractive and made of plastic, then we're going to be making some positive shifts. And if enough of us make these positive shifts and don't say things like, I need a new car each 5 years because I need to live in this giant house an hour from where I work that I'm going to need to commute in. And I don't want to have to deal with fixing my car anytime something breaks down. So I'm just going to, drive it to 100,000 miles, get a new car every 5 years. This attitude is one that younger generations don't seem to have as much. And part of that is because it's a little tougher to make it today than it was 20 years ago. And I mean, you're talking about things like, well, heck, if I wanted to buy a home, I need to have a 20% down. And now the average median home cost is like $750,000, And so it's just not as feasible for them. And so you're coming into a world where people are saying, they're making choices and they're saying, I'm fine, taking subscriptions and maybe I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to rent a car when I need to drive one, but I don't necessarily need to have one every day in my driveway. And I don't necessarily need to budget for gas, therefore, in addition to everything else, or budget for all the extra electricity that it would take to fuel a electric vehicle. These are just some of the things I'm thinking about, but one of the other things that you're drawing me to is the political system we live within, because this good versus bad dichotomy has seemingly led so many of our decisions in this world of extraction that it's like we almost need Democrat versus Republican and nothing in between. You just got to define yourself and we got to duke it out and only one will survive. And yet systems don't change in this leadership that we have running. I don't see a ton of difference from one regimen to the next. We do see some differences, but you're talking about, how the common, and I say common in like the populist perspective, how most people are affected is actually somewhat marginal. I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so many things. So first, I think you're absolutely right that it's just becoming harder to manifest the American dream. I think that the younger generations just aren't going to be able to do it even if they wanted to. And so people are making other choices partly out of necessity, but they're also reclaiming that as a movement of like, no, actually, I don't want the life my parents had anyway. I see some of the downfalls of that. And there's different ways to have security. And one of the ways in an individualistic culture to have security is to have money. So, like you said, if your car breaks down, you've driven 100,000 miles, it breaks down. What do? You call a tow truck person, you have your car towed to the repair person, and you rent a car. If you don't have that, what you have to invest in is social security, community security. And so if your car breaks down, you call a friend, you crash at someone's house. If and there is research that shows sort of this direct relationship between income and community connections. And so people who have lower income have closer and more community connections. And this is thought it's partly based on need. But I think that has the potential to create a big cultural shift as people do it out of necessity. They will also start to realize the benefits of having those connections. So, hopefully that will continue. I think it's already started. Hopefully that will continue. Now, on the political side, that's a big thing. How do we create real change at the political level? I'm glad I'm not a politician. I don't know. I think again, the more we help people wake up to the illusion that what we're invested in is actually the path to happiness, the more people will change their values, change what they vote for, what they put on bills. But it's a real challenge. There's a one thing that's helped me sort of find the wisdom in the middle spaces, because you said, things are so dichotomized, is do you know Jonathan Haidt's book Righteous Minds? Oh, it's sort of a moral psychologist, psychology of morals. He does this really interesting thing. He talks about how, what we usually think of as liberals and what we usually think of as conservatives, and they're fighting against each other, but how they both hold really valuable and necessary perspectives for a functional society. Conservatives tend to want things to stay the same, right? They want to conserve the way that things are. They also tend to be really good at making like fast decisions. And there's a whole bunch of things that they kind of like maintain the solidity of things, whereas liberals are more like really fast change but often have a really hard time making change because everything's like consensus and we have to get everybody on board and we can't leave anybody out. And then another thing is like people who are, yeah, I mean, this is generalizations, right? But people who fall into the conservative camp, research has shown that they tend to be more likely to actually participate in community-based work, to volunteer for their local church, to help their neighbor who they realize doesn't have enough groceries to get to through the week. Whereas people who are on the liberal side are like, I'll just donate to this big organization and they can distribute the money for me. Like, I don't actually want to talk to my neighbor. And so in a way, people on the liberal side who are all about like social justice and income inequality and stuff or income equality also hold a lot of those hyper individualistic ways of being in the world and are sometimes less likely to inconvenience themselves and to really get into investing in their communities and their local societies. So I think there's a place if we could actually recognize the value of what each of us brings to the conversation and recognize that I think underneath a lot of us really do have similar values of wanting to be happy, wanting our kids to be happy, wanting to feel safe in the world. We have very different ideas of how to create that. But, if we can recognize those underlying values and figure out how to work together, how to bring each of our strengths to the table, I think we could get a lot further than just dividing ourselves up and fighting and being like, it's this like one side has to win, right? Like we can't work together. One side has to win over the other side.
So you mentioned that you feel like the conservatives want to keep things broadly the way they've been, and then progressives or liberals or leftists want to see change happen more rapidly. And I agree with that to an extent, but I think what's happened over the last decade in particular is that the conservatives actually don't want things to stay the same as they have been. They want to revert back to an earlier set of ideals and impose religious beliefs on everybody else. And that is, I think, the thing that is hurting our ability to collaborate and cohesively come together in some ways. But then there's also this ideology on the leftist side that is trying to shove down the throat of everybody, I think, some of these terms like, no, climate change is a fact, you must, right? Okay, you're an idiot or a dullard if you can't look at the science. And there's so much judgment kind of going back and forth that we end up strengthening the opposition as opposed to exercising the muscles that enable us to actually connect and talk about the things that we have in common. Now, the founding principles of this country, the United States, have supposed to be are supposed to be separation of church and state. And we're seeing less and less of that, in our present world. So I think there's so much to this story, and it's not anything that can be solved in a single conversation or many conversations. But the thing that I have been most concerned by over the course of this last decade has been the willingness to just remove oneself from the conversation, to say, well, I'm just not going to talk to my racist uncle anymore. I'm just going to dispel this person and reject them or cancel them in some way, shape, or form. So we're just never going to converse. We're never going to be in the same space. We're never going to connect. We're going to read our diametrically opposed news. Each of us view this news as gospel and truth, and the other one as not gospel, not truth. And therefore, we just divide and divide and divide. So, the reason I think that this is so imperative to talk about today, being that obviously I am not a conservative, I am a leftist more than that. I am still the idealist that I was at 13 years old. And I've been told over the years, oh, you'll get over it. You'll become more conservative with time. Just wait until you have $100,000 in your bank account or whatever, like people make all these judgmental comments about, well, it's just because you grew up poor, that's how you think that way. But when you have yours, then you're going to change. None of that has proven true to me. I do own my home, right? It's mostly paid off at this point. But I still have all of these feelings that it's about the whole, not the soul, and that we need to consider the neighbor across the street, whether or not they have the same political ideals or the religious ideals. We need to be inclusive as opposed to exclusive. We need to build bridges as opposed to barriers. But yet, society seems to want to build barriers. so, so how do we reconnect? And is there something, and you're learning in psychology, that can help us do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is fear-based. Again, going back to this, we've been told that we are all in competition with each other, that there's a limited amount of resources, that there's a limited amount of happiness, of success, and that we are all fighting for each other for it. And so we kind of get into our little groups and we decide what we think is, the best path
It's the
to getting
Highlander.
us
There
there.
must be only one type of mentality, right?
Yeah. And I think that's where compassion comes in, right? It's like, no, we can't leave anybody behind. We can't thrive while other people are still struggling. And so we can't write everybody off. We can't round everybody else up that we don't like and send them to an island somewhere or ignore them or whatever. We have to figure out how to, all be here together. I think I appreciate what you said about, on the liberal leftist side, there's challenges there too, right? And a lot of it has been this very righteous, aggressive cancel culture, very
I mean,
dogmatic beliefs
we
and no
called
room for
elitist, and a lot of the
conversation.
time I'm like, well, you're kind of right. We know better, and
Right. I just went to a great conference where we were talking a lot about kind of the anti-science movement and how what I took out of that conversation was that, the right has used or the left, sorry, the left the left has used science to back up its beliefs and to basically say you can't argue with it because we have research studies that show that this is true and this is the best. But science is also based on belief systems. It's also heavily value laden, even though we want to say that it's value neutral. And it's also it's often misused to support the people who are able to wield the power of science against people who aren't able to. And so it hasn't been used honorably in many cases. And I think people are reacting against that also. And it represents a sliver of reality. But I also think, I'm not going to get into conversations about like specific religions and beliefs and all of that. But I also think that there's a place for spirituality, for relational knowing, for intuitive knowing, all of these things that are often discounted in scientific paradigms that I think the right may be trying to bring back in. And because we don't have other systems to talk about it and to bring that in, it ends up just being religion and primarily Christianity. And at this point, primarily kind of fundamentalist Christianity. And so if we're able to see again underneath all of that stuff, it's like, okay, what are the real fears? What are you really afraid of losing? What are you really seeing that we aren't seeing that we might be losing? And then can we go the other way? Like, what are we seeing that you're not paying attention to? What are we seeing? If we're able to exchange information in that way, I think it could be helpful. And someone's got to extend the olive branch, right? Someone's got to be the first to say, you know what, we don't have all the answers and we've also created harm. And when we don't work together, we get really myopic and bad things happen. And so, how do we start to build those bridges again? Yeah, I think people just have to be willing to be the courageous ones that reach across the divide and start the conversations and have that real humility to be like, okay, I really, really believe that what I believe is the only best good thing. But can I even in this conversation open to the possibility that you might also have some wisdom or something valuable to add? It doesn't mean I have to change my belief, but it might expand it. It might deepen it or nuance it. Or maybe I do realize that I was wrong about some things.
well, I feel like we have gotten to a space where we don't value conversation, and broadly. We listen to the talking heads on either side of a political extreme, and we don't read, let's just say, what I would call journalistic newspapers anymore. It's so hard to see, what's biased or what is plainly plainly biased versus somewhat unbiased. I mean, even if I go back to like the days where I got the San Jose Mercury News all the time, I could see the bias in there, sure, but they would cover both sides of a story as much as possible or give you the broad view. And we don't have very many available outlets that do that sort of thing anymore. Like I spend a lot of time reading The High Wire is one of the publications I go to, which is a publication that's put out as an e-newsletter specific to the Pacific Northwest. And it has a lot to do with ecology and, how our environments are running into certain issues, tribal lands versus the colonialist empire and how we're handling some of these things, gender inequities and really deep stories on these topics. Really excellent journalism, like top notch, right? But also very much one side of the story. And if that was all I read and all I saw, then I would have this belief and understanding that we were really at both much more progressive and also much more toxic than we actually are, because often they're pointing fingers at problems. And there's some truth to that, but there's also a broader story that's just not being told. And so I feel like we as a people have a really hard time getting to what the full story is on any subject unless we essentially want to approach it from a scholar's perspective where we're reading every news item we can related to this particular topic and then sitting back to try and absorb and think, what do I think about this with an open frame of mind, which is also really hard to do as a thought experiment because you innately have motions and thoughts and experience that relates to this one thing. So I don't know, I long for the days of Dan Rather in some ways, when at least on TV he would give you the story and everybody would hear kind of the same thing. And we at least could have a conversation about it without just ending up diametrically opposed and locked down.
Yeah. Maybe this is a role for influencers, to get more involved in having these really hard conversations and sort of, they're sort of the culture shapers right now. Like they could be doing that. I mean, and I think some people already are starting to, but we could see more of that. It would be hard
Yeah, I
for
mean,
sure.
there's a few that are willing to have the really fractious conversations, but most, I think, want to be interviewed by people that mostly agree with them.
Of course. Yeah. So it would be an uncomfortable thing. And we don't learn how to do it either, right? Like you said, conversation is not valued, and it's not a skill that we develop how to have conversations. I teach a class on interpersonal communication, which is turned into more of a critical communications class, which is really about, how do we talk to each other? How do we be good listeners? How do we have conversations that are about deeper understanding and the generation of something new together, right? Like I come with ideas and you come with ideas, and we leave the conversation with something more than either of us brought alone. And we don't do that, right? We listen for like, oh, something I'm going to agree with or something I'm going to argue with. And the goal is often try and convince the other person of what you believe, or at the very least, try to make it through the conversation without being impacted in any way yourself. So, I mean, we could be teaching more critical thinking skills, communication, but of course, we'd need the school system to get on board with that, which
I mean, go
is
back and watch
which is
My Dinner with
challenging.
Andre. I doubt many from our present young generation could really sit through the whole thing. They call it boring, right? But that script alone is fantastic. And the way that you confront the early part of the conversation, there's kind of judgment, unwillingness, not sure if I even really want to have dinner with this guy. We've been disconnected for a long time. Who knows? Like all the sort of inner thoughts that we have about somebody expressed through film. And then the power of this really incredible conversation being a so-called mind walk, which also leads me to think of that movie, also with Sam Waterston, which really are, I think, focused on the power of conversational thought and the fact that in many cases we actually get to what we would truly feel and think about something as we're connecting and talking about it, rather than just sitting on the other side of a screen and absorbing it. So there's something about actually engaging in these thought experiments, conversations that can even grow our mindset into something new. I think, for instance, this thing that just happened in Wyoming, and I don't have the news story in front of me, but this backlash around the government saying we don't want to write he, she, they, them, like put pronouns in people's email signatures anymore. And so that is no longer going to happen on the state dime, so to speak, right?
People are not allowed to do it anymore.
So, like, if you're in the public school system or in a public office of any sort, you're just not allowed to do it, right? And so this is, to me, it's a swing back. And I will say that when people first started doing this, I found it kind of alienating. And I was like, well, why? And is that really necessary? And sure, call me whatever. I don't care. But I also, you know, didn't personally need it. Right. And I think the big difference is some people really personally do. And I'm just kind of throwing back to a moment when I was at UCSC with my undergrad. And there was this woman that I worked alongside with in lab for the entire time that we were there. We were both volunteers in the lab. And she dressed very male kind of focused, like had the short haircut and everything else. And then one day just started saying, I'm Richard, right? So not from she to they, but she to him, he, right away, right? And it was really challenging for a lot of the students to make this leap. Like I had an easier time calling him Richard than I did referring to the pronoun he because of my relationship with this person over the course of years, right? It's like, okay, your name's Richard now. I did that, right? But the he, when I was referring to them in the third person, was hard. And so, I mean, granted, this for me was 1997, right? Relatively early in a lot of this conversation. But that means also that I've had experience with this shift for a long time. And even once questioned my gender, went through a few years where I was unsure and dressed mostly as a boy. So I had more sensitivity to this topic as a whole. So, you know, to see that kind of a state, mandate, like this just can't happen anymore because we don't like it, to me communicates that there's an undercurrent that we need to address conversationally through activism and also through just seeking to understand the perspective and bring people along on the journey together so that we don't create more toxicity in an entire state. So, I mean, I'm just troubled by it. I feel like progress doesn't happen necessarily as like a stepped ladder. It often comes like a swing and is somewhat meteoric, which I think we've been in this phase for a while. And then you see things like the fiction depiction of Handmaid's Tale start to mimic reality in our court system to the point where we're like picking at the scabs to reveal where the unease is and where the disagreement is and just how vast that disagreement is.
I agree with you that it's a pendulum swing, and on my more hopeful days, I see the backlash as evidence of how fast things have changed. And if you look especially around gender and sexuality, even I grew up in Texas, right? I'm 42. I was born in 1982. To how it is now, I live in a small town in Arizona. It's not the most liberal town in the world. My daughter went to high school here. It would have been unrecognizable to me as a young person to see the greater support and acceptance for exploration and for queerness and changing names and all that sort of stuff. But we've seen a lot of change very fast, and I'm on the side of thinking that's a great thing. And I also recognize that it is really hard for people, and that on the side of the change, on the left side, people have not been tolerant of any challenge to just jumping on board. Yes, okay, now we're doing they, them. Now we're doing, same sex marriages, whatever. It's just like, nope, this is it. Get with the program, or you are a terrible person and you don't care about other humans. And that's not people's experience, And even with the gender pronouns, I mean, I'm in the queer community, identify as non binary. It's still hard for me, like, to remember to call if people change their pronouns, to remember to call them this. And there's been this, like, often not from the queer community, but from well-meaning allies. There's like the cancel culture and the how dare you not call them by what they want to be called and stuff. And of course, if someone's just being anti, that's different. But it's hard for us to make these changes, even when we want to, even when we're on the inside of it. So I think we have to have more, like, I think because of that, people are afraid that they're not going to get it right. It's like it's a trap. I'm not going to be able to do it to your satisfaction. So I'm just going to say that we shouldn't do this so that I'm not put in the situation where I'm going to be criticized and condemned. I grew up in small town Texas again, like so much of my family is still there. And I feel like I see that in there, that people want to be kind and honoring of who people are. And they're also, I mean, my dad, bless his heart, like there's no way he could remember pronoun changes. I don't think, because he's a,
Well, I should have
he's
asked at the
an
beginning
older
what your
it's just
pronouns
so
are, and I did not do that.
oh, that's okay. She, they is fine. But yeah, so yeah, I think it goes both ways. I think we've created I think we have contributed to the backlash by not allowing any space for moving through that challenge, any space for failure, and even for having conversations about it to really help people understand, like you said, more deeply. Like if you meet someone who, we've said this forever, like racial tensions, socioeconomic tensions, tensions around sexuality and gender. If your neighbor, if you meet someone, you get to know someone who comes from this group that you think is bad for whatever reason, we're more likely to open our hearts and to see things differently. So we need to be able to have those conversations. And also, I did not know about what happened in Wyoming, and I have
Yeah,
feelings
right.
about it too.
Because I mean, this isn't. I understand state rights versus federal rights, but some things they get you in your feels, right? And that's what happened for me today. I was like, how do I feel about this? I feel really conflicted and weird, and I don't even know. Like, it's not like something I could change, obviously, but at the same time, I had these feelings about what's going on in Washington with the Republicans, and they're wanting to say that we don't want to be a democracy anymore. I mean, that's pretty dramatic. I care about that, It's like, okay, so you don't want people to be able to vote is kind of what you're getting to. Like you want the Senate and the people that are in office to make all the decisions, and that we the people no longer get a say in the decisions that really get made anymore. There's something really scary to that undercurrent. And, whether or not they're in a position to really win seats or not, the fact that it's getting news headlines in these environments is like, hmm.
Yeah. Well, I think we all want a democracy until we are outside of the majority and the other side is winning, right? It gets a lot more challenging when there's a greater divide and your side stands to lose a lot. Um Not that, I mean, I hope that I would still choose the democracy, but yeah, lots of
Well, we've
scary
talked
things at the
about so
moment.
very much today, and we've gone a little longer than I intended, partly because of technology challenges. But I do like to offer all of my guests the opportunity to share a closing thought, or if there was a question that I hadn't asked that you wish I had, you could ask and answer it.
One of the things I'm always encouraging people to do is just experiment a little bit with compassion. Experiment with opening your heart a little bit, with connecting, with assuming that the person sitting across from you also cares about things and loves things and has values that you can recognize, and just see what happens. See what happens when you even, compassion practices. I don't know if people are familiar, but if a formal meditation practice, compassion practice, often asks people to first start with yourself, start with someone that you love, sending them wishes for happiness and the alleviation of suffering. And then you slowly start to move towards people that are more challenging for you. And this is where the practice comes in. Can you extend your care and love and authentic desire for people to suffer less to people that you don't automatically agree with or see that you like? And so that's my invitation to people, is just play with that a little bit. People have different reactions, but for the most part, experience and research shows that this actually, for some reason, brings us greater joy and connection. So it's something you can play with and see for yourself.
I love that. I love that as a closing thought. Thank you so much, Sebastienne, for joining me today. And for those that want to learn more about you and everything that you're doing at Prescott College rather, as well as the college you are moving to next, which I believe is in San Francisco, the Institute of Integral Studies, how would you best prefer that they reach out to you?
Well, I think probably LinkedIn is the most consistent because I'll be keeping that across platforms. So you're welcome to find me there. But my new email is also sgrant@ciis.edu.
Yeah, and that was California
You're welcome
Institute
to
of
reach out to me there
Integral
as well.
Studies. I left out the California part of that before, but yes.
Yeah, I'll be there starting July
Congratulations.
1st.
I'm sure that you'll be well loved there and go on to do more amazing things. So again, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a delight.
To find out more about Dr. Sebastienne Grant, visit the links that we provide in show notes. I will provide that link to her LinkedIn as well. You'll find a link to our expanded blog page on caremorebebetter.com, which includes the video version of this podcast episode, complete transcripts, and links to the additional resources and prior episodes that we mentioned in today's episode. As a reminder, we are launching our new Cause Before Commerce site this summer. That is circleb.co. This site will host the same content that you find today on caremorebebetter.com, while also providing helpful tools to help you live a little bit greener and a little more socially and locally engaged. You'll find how-to guides and DIY tools that can help you renew what you have, replace the things you buy, and reduce waste. CircleB.co will offer plastic-free products from housewares and clothing to supplements and personal care items, all of which are circular in design, that minimize waste, and that seek to limit or eliminate plastics. You can explore our landing page today at CircleB.co. Thank you, listeners and watchers, now and always, for being a part of this pod and this community, because together we really can do so much more. We can care more, we can be better, we can even build a more compassionate society that values conversation and prizes Earth and its inhabitants with a community-first perspective. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for social good. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts, and share with your friends to help us reach more people and spread more social good.